everybody, to the Monash Tech Talks AI in Law Enforcement panel in partnership with the Law Faculty. My name is Yasmin London and it's my absolute pleasure to be your moderator and host for today's session. Just by way of background, I'm the Executive Director of an organisation called YSafe, which is Australia's largest provider of cyber safety education. I'm also a former police officer, so I was part of the New South Wales Police Force for 13 years. So today's session and insights are obviously of particular interest to me. Now, we have an amazing hour of power ahead of us, but before we begin, I'd like to start by respectfully asking you to acknowledge the Wiradjuri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I and many of you will be meeting on today, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are all located today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this celebration. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce to you our amazing panellists. And I'm going to start with Dr. Campbell Wilson, who is the Director, Artificial Intelligence for Law Enforcement and Community Safety Lab. Dr. Wilson has keen interests in digital forensics, information retrieval, machine learning and bioinformatics. Since his PhD in the probabilistic modelling of image databases, Dr. Wilson has published extensively in a range of areas such as information retrieval, privacy-enhancing technologies, health information provision, user interface design and content-based image databases. He has also supervised a number of PhD candidates to completion and currently oversees PhD projects in diverse specialisations such as forensic data mining, information retrieval, dynamic adaptation of websites, musical genre recognition and region-based image retrieval. Dr. Wilson is currently the co-director of the Alex Lab, a partnership with the Australian Federal Police, which we'll hear about later today. He's also a celebrated senior lecturer and Associate Dean International in the Faculty of IT at Monash. Welcome, Campbell. That is quite an impressive CV that you have there.
Hi, Yasmin. Pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone.
Next up, we have the amazing Professor Maria O'Sullivan, who is the Deputy Director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law. Associate Professor O'Sullivan is the author of a number of international and national publications on the subject of human rights, public law and technology. Her recent publications include papers on public law implications of automated decision-making and the human rights implications of the COVID Safe app and digital vaccine passports. She is also a regular media commentator on human rights and public law and has been published in The Age, Sydney Morning Herald and The Conversation. Welcome, Maria. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Yasmin. Hi, everyone.
And last but certainly not least, we have Commander Doug Bowdry from the AFP. Commander Bowdry has nearly 23 years of policing experience, working across a variety of different capabilities, including community policing, technical surveillance, digital forensics, enterprise ICT, and more recently in covert and technical operations. Commander Bowdry played a significant leadership role during Operation Ironside. I'm really excited to learn more about this today. The largest operation ever undertaken by the AFP, which dealt a significant blow to serious and organised crime, both here in Australia and internationally. In his current capacity, Commander Bowdry works as part of a group who drafted the new surveillance legislation amendment, the Identify and Disrupt Act 2021, and led the implementation of that legislation into operations for the AFP. Commander Bowdry has a keen interest in the development of ethical machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities for law enforcement. He is continuously looking for opportunities in which government, academia and private industry can collaborate more effectively. He played a key role in the establishment of the AFP and Monash University AI for Law Enforcement Community Safety Lab, so ALEX, and holds the position of Executive Board Member. Welcome, Doug. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Yasmin. It's great to be here. Really look forward to the next hour.
I've just been corrected as well, Doug. My apologies on the pronunciation of your name. I've got Boudry. That is my mistake. Thank you so much for the correction there. Campbell, I think it was you actually. Okay, now let's get down to business. One thing that we know for sure is that when it comes to AI, there are some incredibly promising applications when it comes to the law enforcement industry. Its ability to identify patterns allows police to better predict, anticipate and prevent crime. It can also help ensure work is less time consuming, less prone to human error and fatigue. And certainly as a police officer, I can speak to the fact that that can happen. And ultimately, it can be more cost effective. However, there are some obvious risks and serious ethical considerations when it comes to how police can and do use this to, create positive outcomes. So, Campbell and Doug, I might throw this first question to you. And I just want to know, what are the ways that law enforcement typically use AI in standard practice these days?
Campbell, I might take this one first. I guess from an AFP perspective, and I'll talk mainly from an Australian perspective, because I think when you start talking about AI, it is largely driven by legislation and policy, and that's nuanced even across Australia in terms of Commonwealth and state jurisdictions as well. From our perspective, we really look at it from a triage perspective. As you said, there's a burnout or a tiring sort of effect of policing. And when you start looking at what's happening in our environment, we've got a lot more mobile devices, a lot more data coming through in terms of our investigations. Only 10 years ago, we were talking megabytes and gigabytes. Now we're talking terabytes and petabytes. So what we're really looking for AI to help us with is to actually find those needles in a haystack, really, to find that intelligence or evidentiary material that helps us disrupt crime or prosecute crime. And we're also looking for it to help us identify victims. We also looked for it to I guess, protect our members from harmful materials as well. So we've got things such as child sexual abuse material or extremist material that has a detrimental effect on the mental health of our members. So we use it for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's critical. I work in education when it comes to cyber safety and child exploitation and child exploitation material, and these sorts of things are incredibly difficult for law enforcement to see on a daily basis. So that's incredibly helpful. We talked earlier about the fact that it can be subject to error. Thinking back to things like criminal data, sometimes that can be really partial or unreliable in its nature. How do we guard against mistakes when it comes to AI?
It's a big question, and I think it goes to the question of the limitations of AI and understanding, I guess, not just the technology, but how it's used in practice. And if we're talking in particular about machine learning, which is a very, well-known flavor of AI, I guess, that's trained on large quantities of data. And in terms of error rates, it's pretty much garbage in, garbage out as far as machine learning goes. And you want to make very sure that the data you're training on is representative of the population that you're looking at. I mean, population in a statistical sense here. That it's inclusive, the data that enables the AI to make sort of fair decisions. And I think also it's very key to just have a continual review cycle. I mean, technology doesn't exist on its own. As I said, it's how it's used. The people that it's affecting, you need to be continually reviewing those impacts. So it's really a cyclic process, I think, to make sure the AI is doing what it's intended to do and not sort of drifting, if you like.
Yeah, keeping a close eye on it, I guess. Maria, the next thing I wanted to ask, I guess, which I might throw to you if that's okay, how does this affect our rights to privacy as citizens? Is it ethical? What's the situation here?
Yeah, and just drawing on those excellent observations of Campbell and Doug, We do have existing inequalities such as race discrimination and sex discrimination, not just in Australia, in most, if not all, societies. So we talk about AI as a new thing, and it is new, but I guess it's very much just enhancing sometimes those existing structural inequalities. And we do have a number of things in the law that can help that. For example, this idea of procedural fairness or due process. So, for example, if a police officer has a body camera, that ideally the police officer would say, I'm going to put my body camera on now. So the person affected, that is, who's going to have their privacy breach, will know that the body camera is on. Or otherwise, there should be a supposition that the body camera is always on. And we can get to that later. So yes, there are clear privacy concerns, but in both human rights and privacy law, we do balance the competing interests. So the interests of law enforcement, which is more of a collective or public interest, as opposed to the individual freedoms that people may have.
Mm-hmm. Doug, just reflecting on what Maria said, in terms of due process, do you find that police struggle with that? If we're talking about, body cams, for example, cautioning people that we're interacting with is sort of part and parcel of the police role. Are there any barriers to that due process that come up for you from a law enforcement perspective?
Yeah, I think having been involved in the deployment of body-worn cameras for the AFP, it was really interesting in terms of trying to balance what we needed from an operational perspective alongside some of the legislative barriers that we had. And when you actually look at an Australian context, we not only had Commonwealth legislation which governed when you can actually use video, but you also had state legislation. So when we were trying to use body-worn cameras in places such as airports, we had to actually try and harmonise in some ways the legislation between Commonwealth and state and the operational use of those devices. So there is sometimes some contention around that. We also find that there's contention in the community as to how the community wants us to actually use body-worn cameras. If you have a look at it, a lot of the time people are sitting there saying, we want body-worn cameras on all the time. But if you're actually entering a person's home, you're with a camera on, there's a privacy issue there with that particular individual, and they might not want that. So there's always a bit of a contention, and I think it goes to a point that Maria made around that contention between the community and the privacy of an individual.
Absolutely. And look, we'll talk a bit more about body cams later throughout the session, but it's certainly an interesting area to have a focus on. Doug, I might just stick with you for a second, and Campbell, afterwards, I'd love to get your perspective. I'd like to talk a little bit about Operation Ironside. And I guess my first question is, when it comes to the AI technology, what unique benefits did it provide that maybe expedited the investigations process or prosecution of the POIs that you were looking at?
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin. I guess Ironside was a real interesting one for us, just because it was so large and the data sets were really, really large in terms of that collection. We really had to be really careful around the fact that it was criminal communication. So that was one thing that we were sort of having to work through. And I guess part of what we were looking at in terms of an AI, from an AI perspective, was natural language processing. So we had a lot of communications. We needed to understand whether that was criminal communications. So we were using it to help triage that. We also had issues around language identification. So because crime is essentially borderless, we had a lot of people from very different ethnic backgrounds speaking a lot of different languages. So being able to understand the languages that were being used, being able to actually translate those messages and then be able to triage them so that we could send the most important messages off to interpreters was really important for us. And the other piece that we had was managing threat to life. And this was one of the most, I guess, difficult pieces for us. what we found was that at its peak, we had about 30 threats to life every hour coming through the platform that we were having to triage to work out whether it was criminals just talking tough, or it was actually a real imminent threat to life. So we were developing tools to be able to actually do that for us and become more accurate over the years that operation was being undertaken. So it was a really important piece there. The other thing that we were using it for was really using computer vision, and that was around identifying items in images. So there were some really important things such as firearms that we were interested in. Where firearms turned up in images, we were really sort of focused on that, because that sort of fed into some of the things that we saw around threat to life, but also some of the key priorities for us in terms of getting firearms off the streets and preventing harm to the community.
That's amazing. It's so helpful. When it comes to, I guess, those components of a police investigation without the benefit of AI, let's talk about, for example, deciphering language and using interpreters. How much time has it saved you? I remember my days in the police force, it was whether somebody was available to interpret for a crime. If it was a night shift, it was, you were out of luck most of the time. How much time did this save you during this investigation?
Yeah, it's like, to be quite honest, we couldn't have done it without it. So in terms of times, I haven't really got a metric. I can tell you it's saved us millions of dollars of taxpayers' money in terms of interpreters, because a lot of the time, it allowed us just to triage that, put the important things that would go to court to the interpreters, and be able just to park the other comms which weren't really going to go to into a court-based process. We were able to park that to the side. So it really saved us millions, and realistically, we wouldn't have been able to do it without it.
Were there any drawbacks, anything unexpected where it hindered progress?
Yeah, the thing that we struggled with was the fact that criminals talk their own language. So you hear a lot about. So if you talk in some of to our African interpreters, like with languages from Africa, they've each got their own dialect. The criminals, our criminal syndicates, have exactly the same things. So what we found were a lot of the tools were not that we were looking at were not fit for purpose. They were good for translating and transcribing conversations that you and I might have, but were not that effective in the first instance for actually understanding criminal conversations.
Yeah, amazing. Campbell, I might move on to you, talking about the work that Monash does in developing AI for law enforcement through Alex Lab. What's the value of this partnership? How does it work?
Sure. I think the value of the partnership, there's three things I think about. The first one is translating research into practice, and I think everything Doug just talked about, from a computer science point of view, there's 20 or 30 really interesting, tough problems to address there, and the use case there in this case is large network of data of criminal networks. But from a research point of view, as I said, there's some really curly questions in there. Our researchers are really interested in coming up with solutions to these problems. So the first thing is that the collaboration, the Alex Lab, really helps with that translation of research into practice. The second thing I would say, and I think it's something we're definitely going to touch on a little bit more in this talk, is that the solutions to these problems, it goes back to something I just said about technology not existing in isolation, that the solutions to these problems to be effected in an ethical way need lots of eyes on the problem from lots of perspectives. So I think, dare I say, a university like Monash, a very broad-based research university, is the perfect organisation to partner with to bring in all those different perspectives. So in the Alex Lab, we obviously do work with computer scientists, but also with lawyers, with socio-technical experts, criminologists and the like, ethicists, because this domain is such an interesting area of applying technology in a way that really affects people. And the third thing I would say, and I'm sure Doug could speak to this as well, that I think it really speaks to that police community partnership, that that policing really is most effective when it's done in close collaboration with the community, using the research community in this way to help translate cutting edge research into practice, which affects community safety, I think really sort of walks the talk on that partnership. So those are the three things I'd say are the main value points of the collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. You jumped ahead. My next question was just around how that partnership, I guess, reassures community perceptions that police are using technology ethically, that it's based on, research that is reputable. Doug, would you agree that that's an incredibly important aspect of this partnership?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to be quite honest, there's a social contract between police and the community, and it is something that we think about a lot in terms of how police actions impact the community and how that actually affects their perception of police, but also is it the right thing to do for the community? So it's sort of there's always a lot of thought going in. Working with a university gives us that rigor, like that I guess that academic rigor around some of the things that we're doing. We can sit there and we can look at AI, be able to sort of work with a university, have the academic rigor around it so that it's actually being peer reviewed outside of the law enforcement bubble per se, so that you don't just sort of get that sort of that sound bubble that you get where you're just talking within your own group. You have that rigor, you have the diversity of thought, actually having a look at what we're trying to do and providing advice back, but also academia is a good representative sort of sample of the community as well, just because of its just because of their diverse nature as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it comes down to trust, doesn't it? That's how we create solutions, how we get that community participation and buy-in, and that's incredibly important when it comes to the policing role in general. I'm going to change tack a little bit now, and I'm going to ask you, Maria, in light of the pandemic, this has sort of been dominating everybody's lives for the last couple of years. What are some of the more recent or even unknown ways that data is being used by law enforcement in this capacity? Can police access COVID data such as QR codes, for example?
Yes, technically, but again, it depends on the jurisdiction. And Doug raised a very important point about some of the mismatch between Commonwealth and state and territory. So if I can talk to the QR code issue, last year there was an attempt by the Victorian Police to access QR codes and one attempt in Western Australia. And the responses of both of those states have been to include QR code protections, I guess, in legislation, but in differing thresholds, using different thresholds. So I can speak to the Victorian example. What I would say, generally speaking, going to the trust issue, is that with COVID, we've got, I guess, an enhanced interaction with police. So there are many people who've never had much of interaction with police, and this is the first time, when they're out and about, or maybe even a protest, or even just in a public space when they get stopped by police. So I think COVID has enhanced the police interactions and also the issue of trust. And one of the things with QR codes, both legally and socially, is that we give that data to public health for a public health reason, for contact tracing. So on a privacy level, legally, it's not supposed to be used for another purpose. Now, it can be complicated with consent, but the the legal remit is that privacy law would protect that. And then also bringing up the themes we've been talking about with trust. Even if it is legally possible for police to use that QR code information, should they? Because one of the problems is, particularly in a public health context, is that once trust is broken down, people aren't going to use QR codes. So I think the interesting thing about COVID is this interaction between the public health response and the nuanced, I guess, limited nature of perhaps some of the police action.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about a legitimate reason to use it, what would that be? If you could come up with a couple, what would be a legitimate reason that police could then use that data?
Yes, I think the West Australian legislation says actually you can use it if it relates to a public health offence. So that would be where you've got COVID and you go out and you actually spread COVID. I would imagine a police officer could get a warrant if it was a serious matter, such as a murder investigation, but they would have to, in most jurisdictions, get a warrant. But I might give the technical response to our police officer, Doug, for clarification of that. But again, that would be looking at the balancing between that public interest and the individual rights.
Absolutely. Doug, any comments on that?
No, I think Maria actually hit the nail on the head there. Like there is that nuance between Commonwealth and state. I know from our perspective, at a Commonwealth level, we were not able to access that data. It was written in legislation, and we've had to build systems around that to make sure that we don't collect it. And we've also got oversight by the Commonwealth Ombudsman around it. Those legitimate reasons that Maria were talking around, like health breaches, and also potentially things such as murder and the like. Yeah, from a state perspective, possible. But obviously, once again, you're having to get a warrant for that, and you're having to weigh up the impact that has on the community versus, I guess, with the crime of murder, which is a very serious offence, with the impact that may have on people not actually using the QR codes for a health reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes complete sense. Maria, talking about private companies that design and sell AI technology, to the best of my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not required to reveal their algorithms. So can human rights law in any way constrain these companies? If not, why not?
Yeah, great question. Technically not. Technically, what we have in Australia is that internationally too, businesses are not technically parties to a treaty. So say we've got the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Australia is a party to. It's a very popularly ratified treaty, and it talks about the right to private life and security of person, etc. Businesses, corporations like Microsoft or Amazon, Clearview, they're not a party to those treaties, but there is a movement called Business and Human Rights, where we would encourage businesses to sign up to, if you like, a code of conduct or a set of principles. So you try and use what's called soft law rather than treaty law to encourage them to adhere to these principles. And as a human rights scholar, we try to encourage that, not only because it's good for human rights and the right to privacy, but also companies tend to like putting that in their annual report. So to make them socially responsible, etc. So there's a regulatory aspect, and then I think a social responsibility aspect to that as well.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important, because I guess when we have a lack of transparency, that can often lead to a lack of accountability or perceptions of a lack of accountability. What do you think the solution is there in terms of perceptions around that ideal?
Yeah, academics like myself and also the Australian Human Rights Commission have been talking about having AI safety assessments. So ideally, before that technology is actually implemented by government, they would do this, or they would ask the private company to assess the technology using both a human rights lens and also privacy law. And I say those two things separately because there are different sorts of principles for those two contexts. So as a human rights scholar, I would advocate for the use of these assessments before the facial recognition or the body camera or whatever technology is actually implemented, rather than having lawsuits or complaints to the ombudsman or other oversight after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Campbell, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think part of this is speaks to the sort of way we work in the lab as well, which is that transparency and trust is best affected by being completely open with what you're doing. So, we would open source all our technology as much as possible, publish, peer review, etc., as Doug referred to earlier, and just make sure that everything we're doing is explained clearly from our point of view. Of course, how that's implemented operationally by police would be something that the police forces would explain as well. But I think from the lab's point of view, having that transparency and openness is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Maria, the Human Rights Commission Tech Human Rights Report came out in December in 2021. What have government bodies said about privacy and ethics and the use of AI by law enforcement?
Yeah, the Australian Human Rights Commission report released in May last year was excellent, and I'd recommend that. So it's called Technology and Human Rights. And I guess one of the maybe the more controversial aspects is their recommendation 19 and 20, about the banning of facial recognition software, not only about the use of that by law enforcement, but also more holistically. And this really goes to some of the unwanted implications of using things like facial recognition. So say I want to go to a protest and it's lawful, it's not during a COVID lockdown. The use of facial recognition and CCTV can have a chilling effect. That is, that people may not want to go to that public space and protest if they know they're going to be subject to facial recognition. So this has been done elsewhere. I believe Germany has a proposal for banning facial recognition software, and parts of America, namely California. So there is a precedent for that. But I'd be interested in my panel members' views, because there is a school of thought which says we should have the software because it does have a beneficial purpose, but strictly regulate it. So my question would be, there's a balance between banning it and allowing it under strict regulation.
Doug, any comments from a law enforcement perspective?
Yeah, I think Maria's got some really good points there. There are I guess different jurisdictions that have banned it. I think to be quite honest, like there are benefits for law enforcement, particularly when you're trying to find victims in large data sets. So if you have a look at child sexual abuse material, a lot of the time you are trying to find a victim that's potentially in a large data set. So there's aspects like that. I think it's probably one of those, I guess, those technologies where we do have to be extremely careful around its use. And I do think Maria makes some really good points around the fact that it does have chilling effects on some of the other things that we actually like in the community, in terms of that freedom of speech and that freedom for a peaceful protest and the likes. So I think it is a very a tenuous balancing act in terms of the impact it has on the community once again, and then also potentially protecting individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think thinking about that chilling effect, I think we possibly look overseas to places like China and, get concerned about social profiling, for example, that may be happening over there coming onto our shores here. Are there any common misconceptions that people have when looking at AI in law enforcement? Campbell, I might throw to you first. Any misconceptions that you'd like to bust today?
I think the discourse around facial recognition is a really interesting one, because I think it goes back to, again, there's technology and there's technology in use. in practice for particular purposes. You know, I use facial recognition to log onto my phone. I use facial recognition at the border, you know, and put my passport in the gate. That's facial recognition. I don't think there's a call to ban that sort of one-to-one facial matching. I think the issue is around the one-to-N facial matching, where the face is uploaded and matched against a huge database. But even then, I think it goes to the purpose. And I think any legislation or regulation around that would be well served by specifying some of the purposes quite specifically, I think, because it's an area that's going to grow. The technology is already very mature, and I think it's all going to come down to those use cases and how those use cases fit with societal expectations. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a sort of an education piece perhaps around that sort of discourse.
Absolutely. Maria, do you have any comments to add about misconceptions?
Oh, yeah, I just want to absolutely agree with Campbell there. One of the core principles of privacy law is the purpose for which data is collected has to be the purpose for which it's used. So with the QR codes, public health purpose has to be used for public health purposes. So, yeah, absolutely specifying the purpose. And I think generally people need to be educated. And I'm my worst enemy here because, you know, it says accept all cookies, and to my embarrassment, sometimes I just press yes, accept all cookies. I think we're all guilty of doing that. Or on Facebook, you know, maybe I don't, have the right privacy settings. And that's another thing to raise when we're talking about privacy. This is going, I guess, to one of the questions in the chat about the use of social media by the police. If we're using social media, a lot of the privacy settings there are putting the onus on the user. So Facebook and Twitter will often say, well, if you want to protect your privacy, you have to configure your own user settings. That's going off a little bit on a tangent, but I think speaks to this issue of education and the fact that people, as Campbell said, will use their passport at the border and not realise that that's facial recognition. So I do think there needs to be more education about AI in the community, and also, on the other hand, people's rights to privacy and human rights more generally.
Absolutely. And you know what, you haven't gone off on a tangent, because my next question was to do with, I guess, cybersecurity. And if we're talking about cookies, we're talking about privacy settings and people's knowledge around security. One of the things that we know is that, the person is the lowest common denominator when it comes to a cyber attack or a breach. When it comes to AI, is that a real threat in terms of AI in law enforcement?
Yeah, I think, once again, AI can be a double-edged sword in that situation, particularly around cyber. One thing that we've seen is that, with technology, we've really seen an individual being able to impact a very large number of people. So AI can be used to actually identify large groups of victims, which I guess is a positive in some ways. But then also you have AI potentially being used as the actual crime vector to steal identities and the like. We're starting to see things such as deep fakes and the like coming through. So there's a bit of a double-edged sword with AI. I think it probably goes back to your misconception question as well. There is misconception around AI being bad a lot of the time, and that's probably a lot of the narrative, whereas AI in law enforcement can be actually a bit of a positive, particularly when we are talking about large-scale cyber attacks where people might not even realise they're victims. And we've seen that previously, where we're trying to identify victims and say, hey, by the way, you need to clean up a bit of a mess here so that you don't continue to be a victim.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask each of you this next question, and Campbell, I'll start with you. Is there anything that we're leaving out in this conversation that you think needs to be addressed, that you think needs to be raised today for people to know about?
I could talk about this for days, but I think we've covered on the big issues. And I think bringing out the ethics angle is very important, and the fact that it's, as I said, it's not just technology, it's technology in context. And I think we've covered that. And I'm just sort of keeping an eye on the questions. I suspect we're going to cover that a little bit more when we get to the questions. I think it's been a really good discussion.
Great. Doug, anything from you before we go over to the Q&A?
No, I think a lot of, like, just looking at those questions, I think we're going to cover a few things, but I think just reiterating Campbell's points, I think he's covered it.
Maria, I predict you're probably going to say the same thing, but is there anything else before we go to Q&A that you would like to raise that you think is really important for the audience here to know today?
I would, and that speaks to what Campbell and Doug were very well saying at the start, and that is about the need to bring in non-lawyers. And so I would say it's important to think philosophically about what we're speaking here. And Doug, I think, was talking about deep fakes. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go deep here and say I think we need to reconceptualize actually some of the legal terms we use. What does it mean to be human, for instance? And this is an interest of mine from robotics, animal robotics and sex robots. What does it mean to be human? If we have deep fakes and that deep fake is used, how does that interact with law enforcement paradigms and legislative definitions? And also, I think the demarcation between public and private, again, Doug's mention of body-worn cameras and the use in the home. Public spaces and private spaces are generally quite demarcated historically, but I think we're having a conflation. I think both law and also police activities probably needs to be mindful of that going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Technology sort of muddies the waters a little bit sometimes, doesn't it? We have in legislation public and private spaces and, the rights of law enforcement, in those different spaces. But with technology, it's certainly a little bit more blurry. I'll go to the Q&A now. And the first question is for you, Doug. And that question is, what do you think about strong AI that reproduces AI? If there was an error in AI, is there any law enforcement or legal related or legal requirements, I imagine, related to strong AI?
Yeah, I think, look, it's like it's going to be a problem for us, I think, going forward, because I guess when you're starting to try and attribute who's actually doing the offending there, that's quite difficult when you've sort of got this consequential sort of impact happening there. So I think for me that was a really interesting question in terms of how would you actually prosecute something there. I don't think we've seen anything from a policy or a legislative perspective yet on things such as strong AI. So and I think it probably goes to a lot of what Maria's saying, is that we probably need to reconceptualise how we think about some of these things, and then also how we mention and policy around it.
Maria, any comments on that?
No, I think Doug's answered that very well. Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, the next question is from Ruth, and this is thrown out to any member on the panel. Any comments on the use of public data sets like social media images by the police force, including the AFP? The Clearview AI case has been referenced.
Yeah, I can probably start off with that. Thanks, Yasmin. That speaks to, I guess, the purpose for which you put material on social media. And I have some legal concerns, as do many others, about Facebook, for example. I don't want to pick on Facebook, but I probably wouldn't be the first. And I think, they're, as I said, they put the onus on the user to configure the settings. And then again, from a privacy point of view, if I put my images on social media for my friends and family, I don't think that it should be used by law enforcement. But again, if there is a murder case and there's a significant public interest, then yes, they should be able to get a warrant. But I think particularly the media sometimes scope up the public images too. That can cause problems with misidentifying people. And that happened, with the Clio case, for instance, where that perpetrator was misidentified. Of course, that's a media issue, but then sometimes that can feed into problems for law enforcement. So this is a big debate about social media, but I would say with privacy law, the purposes for which you give those images are not for law enforcement. So again, there needs to be a proper configuring of the purpose.
Campbell, any comments from you?
Yeah, we're actually dealing with a sort of a related issue in the lab at the moment around collection of data, and for instance, if you want to build an image classifier that can detect someone's age, for instance, and I'm not going to go into the technical details of how difficult that is and how fraught that is from a technical point of view. It's incredibly difficult and a fraught technical problem. But one thing you want to do as a part of that is to collect a whole lot of images of people at different ages in order to test your algorithms. And in particular, if you're interested in estimating the age of people under 18, ideally you would have a data set consisting of faces of people aged under 18. How do you test an algorithm ethically in that environment? What I think you don't do is to go to the web and just scrape images of children and just search for images of children and download them. So we've actually got a bit of an effort in the lab around the ethical curation of that sort of data set. And we thought a lot about how to actually go about that. And one of our lab members came up with a brilliant idea that to get around the problem of asking children to provide images of themselves, which is in itself very fraught, and we wouldn't be doing that, asking adults to provide images of themselves as children. By doing that, they're very much aware of what image they're providing, what it's going to be used for. There's informed consent. There's the opportunity to withdraw that consent in future. And that's, to our mind, a much more ethical and consentful way of getting those data sets. But I think just the idea of scraping from social media, whether it's for training algorithms or whether it's for any purpose other than the purpose that the user put the image there, as Maria said, I think is particularly difficult one. We're trying to address that with that project at the moment.
Is AI, do you see AI being able to meet that burden of proof when it comes to being able to stipulate a child's age, for example? I know, just looking back to some of the legislation that we deal with when it comes to the sharing of explicit images by young people, sexting and nudes. I know that within that legislation, the appearance of a young person being under the age of 16 or 18 is included.
Yeah. So there's apparent age, there's real age. It's technically an incredibly difficult problem even for human beings, let alone algorithms. But in any case, if you want to accelerate the effort, you need data to test against.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Next question's from Mike. How can we still maintain a balance between individuals' privacy and the surveillance by state in the era of technology and the use of AI in enforcing laws? Happy for anybody to take this question. I'm sure you'd all have something to say. Doug, do you want to have a go at this?
Yeah, I think so. I think it probably goes back to some of the stuff which Maria was saying earlier around sort of those privacy considerations and the human rights considerations early in a process. So I think, and it probably goes back to the Clearview question previously, like the AFP copped a really bad breach off the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner around not doing privacy impact assessments around that, even for a proof of concept. I think that early, that was a massive lesson for us, making sure that we've got the appropriate considerations around privacy, doing those privacy impact assessments or the threshold assessments, as well as potentially if there's human rights assessments that we have to do in the future, having that actually bedded down so that we actually know what the process is, but also that we're clear about it and transparent about it as well. So having that built in to our processes when bringing this technology on is going to be, I think, an important thing. And probably goes to hopefully addressing some of those concerns that the community may have.
Maria, did you want to comment?
Yeah, fantastic points from Doug. I also just want to think about vulnerable communities. So when we talk about over-policing in Australia, homelessness, Indigenous communities, perhaps migrant communities, and I guess that speaks to maybe surveillance in the COVID scenario as well, in public places, not just during COVID, but I think we have to think about my point earlier about existing structural inequalities, how surveillance and big data then affects those vulnerable communities. So yes, there is the privacy concern, and I absolutely agree with the need for privacy impact assessments and also consideration of particularly vulnerable communities within that space.
Yeah, that's absolutely imperative. Next question is from David. Would the Australian police consider working together with other universities in Asia as well? Doug, I assume that one would be best answered by you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Campbell can actually probably talk to it better than most. We've already had engagement with Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. So we've sort of got engagement there. I think it's really about finding that diversity. And I think that this is probably part of academia's, I guess, strengths, is it can work with universities across the globe. And part of why we enjoy working with Campbell so much was because of his, I guess, strengths in that international space. So definitely interested in partnerships through the lab, that's for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. Campbell, anything that you'd like to add? The benefits.
Oh, absolutely echo that, and that this is what Maria and I and academics do. We work with international partners. We use our networks, and we really just want to bring to bear people who can help with the problems wherever they are. And again, the diversity of views and approaches that Doug was talking about. But I think in this area, it's also really interesting the kind of jurisdictional differences and local contexts for some of the applications of this technology is also fascinating. And I think we'll only do more of it.
Absolutely. The next question is from Mike, and I think we have touched on this topic, but if there's any other insights you'd like to add, his question is, to what extent do you agree with law enforcement officers' right to intercept telephone and email communications for the purposes of law enforcement, including child pornography, narcotics cases and terrorism, so obviously those high-level criminal offences? What are your thoughts on that, Maria? Do you agree that they should be able to do that?
Yes, it'd have to be on a case-by-case basis, and it'd have to be a significant reason. Look, I'm not across so much the technicality with terrorism, but just as a general view, again, with balancing rights, most human rights can be balanced. By that I mean we can say, for example, with the public health response, people have to stay at home and isolate. So that's a typical example where we restrict individual freedom for a public good. So going to the law enforcement issue about intercepting telephone communications for terrorism, we would say your privacy can be limited as an individual because of the overriding public interest. I think, though, we would need to drill down to say, okay, is it just because you hung out with a certain group? Is there a prima facie case that you're involved in terrorism, which gives us a reason for issuing that warrant?
And I think that possibly goes back to your comments around racial inequalities and how AI is used with those communities. That's really important consideration. Doug, do you have any additional comments from a policing perspective?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, essentially telecommunications intercept is actually defined in legislation, and the thresholds for the offences that we're actually able to use, I guess, that capability for. There is an important piece of work going on over the next couple of years called the electronic surveillance reform, which is really trying to bring together a muddle of legislation which crosses across telecommunications intercept and surveillance devices to try and harmonise that. And I think that's a great opportunity, really, for not only law enforcement and government, but also the community to redefine the thresholds and what powers law enforcement has. So I think there's a process that we'll see happen over the next couple of years, which will be very interesting just to see where that lands and what powers actually, I guess, make up that legislation in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of a watch this space, isn't it? A couple more questions in the final minutes that we have today. A question about victim identification in mass disaster. And again, Doug, I'm sort of throwing this to you from a policing perspective. Does it exist, or is it being used at the moment?
I haven't seen it used in that context, I have to admit. So I'll be quite honest. I haven't seen it from my perspective in terms of a disaster. We do, I guess, as the AFP, have a disaster victim identification capability that we've deployed to things such as the Bali bombings, the tsunami in Indonesia and the like. But at that, I think some of the, I don't recall us actually using those sorts of capabilities in that context.
Campbell, do you have anything to add?
Not aware of any specifics. I'm certain people would be working on it. We've had some discussions with the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine around that sort of work. So I dare say there is a fair bit of work going on in that area.
Much needed, that's definitely an area that it would be incredibly beneficial to have that assistance. The last question I might ask is around criminal organisations, and I think this would be really interesting upon reflection when we talk about Operation Ironside. Are we seeing criminal organisations employ countermeasures to some of the capabilities enabled by AI? Maria, Doug, Campbell, Doug, anybody happy to answer this one?
Doug, I reckon. It's your question.
Yeah, look, I think
I should throw that one to you.
Yeah, I think to be quite honest, it takes time for sort of criminal organisations to sort of start to understand what capabilities law enforcement have, and it's part of this ongoing good guy, bad guy sort of thing that we've got going on, I guess, with as to what capabilities we use. But I think what we do see in any law enforcement effort against criminal organisations, there's always a counter effort to deploy countermeasures, or whether they're technical or whether they're like a methodology to actually counter those. So whilst I don't think we've seen it so far in terms of trying to counter AI used by law enforcement, I think it'll be a thing in the future. It's definitely something. If you look at the trend over time, that will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. For every action, there is generally an equal reaction, and so I suppose have to expect that. Just before we go into final comments, I just wanted to ask each of you, because this is such a big topic, it's such an important topic. For people who want to know more, what would you suggest as a fantastic resource for them to dive deeper into AI in general, or AI when it comes to law enforcement? Campbell, I'll start with you.
Very happy for people to contact me directly. There's an Alex Lab website that we have. I welcome people getting in touch to learn about us and work with us.
Fantastic. It's great to have that direct contact with you. Maria, what would you suggest?
I think there's some good international organisations like AI Now, and in Australia, Digital Rights Watch. And then again, if you're interested in the human rights or privacy aspect, you can go on the Castan Centre for Human Rights. So just Google Castan Centre for Human Rights, and on our webpage, we do have some references to things like the COVID Safe app, etc.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And lastly, Doug, what about you? Any suggestions?
I'm going to echo Maria and Campbell there, but I'm also going to give a bit of a shout out to the Prado dialogue, which Monash holds. It has been really, really good, and I know beneficial for me to actually attend those and listen to what's said there. Really interesting presenters with, once again, diverse perspectives. So it's if you want to sort of jump on there, it's well worth it.
Fantastic. Look, everybody, we have run out of time. I'm sure we'd love to keep you online and continue asking these questions. It's obviously such an interesting topic for so many people. But I'd like to thank you, Maria, Doug and Campbell, for your time today. Really, really insightful session. So thank you so much for sharing your incredibly valuable experiences with us. I'd also like to thank the team for organising today. It's been absolutely amazing. The next Monash Tech Talks is actually taking place on the 2nd of March and is the International Women's Day special for the Greener Good, a new climate for gender equity, hosted by the amazing Tracy Spicer. My name is Yasmin London. I'd like to thank you again for joining us and have a fantastic rest of your day. See you next time.